Well, to make you feel better, Don, here's your Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Tennessee Wakeup Club. We live in interesting times. I'm still, I don't know, disappointed, dumbfounded by the decision of the jury on this case with respect to the Clinton attorney giving the information to the FBI, claiming that he was acting independently. Completely open and shut case, but it had to go before an Obama-appointed judge, and a jury which included 3 donors to the Hillary Clinton campaign. One of those jurors contributed to Ocasio-Cortez's campaign. So I guess it isn't surprising what happens, but it is chilling to think of the odds against any of us surviving something that goes to court with in the District of Columbia where they voted 94% against Trump. It's just appalling. It's one of the things that we have to live with, but it's grim. I encourage you to live tweet our event today. The hashtag is on the screen. In 2022, your Leadership Institute has already trained 4,786 conservatives at 180 separate training programs. And since 1979, the Leadership Institute has trained 247,730 activists, students, and leaders. You have before you our schedule for upcoming months. I urge you to take a moment to review these schools and consider attending one or sending a friend to one of our trainings. If you are watching online, please visit our website at leadershipinstitute.org/training to see upcoming online and in-person training. It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Fowler, who will offer an invocation and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. She is the Campus Reform Correspondent Intern here now. She's from Mount Carmel, Illinois, and soon graduates with her associate degree in Arts and Sciences from Wabash Valley College in the same town. Upon graduation, Emily plans to transfer to the Masters University in Santa Clarita, California, where she will major in music. She serves as a student senator at her college and is an Illinois Campus Reform correspondent. Outside of school, she enjoys music, art, and, God bless her, reading. Emily?
Please pray with me. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for this day and for this breakfast. I thank you for Mr. Nix and for his generosity in coming here to spend the morning with us. I pray that you would bless the conservatives who have gathered here as well as those who could not be with us today. Please help our fellowship today to be unifying to the conservative movement. As Mr. Blackwell said earlier, these are interesting times, and unity is needed now more than ever. I pray that your hand would be on the Leadership Institute and all that they do. And I pray that this food would nourish and bless our bodies and that everyone would have a safe trip home. In your holy name I pray, amen.
Amen.
Please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Emily. Now my pleasure is to introduce to you Deirdre Hackelman. She's going to give a programs report. Deirdre is Director of Program Operations and Events here at the Leadership Institute, and she manages all internal and external events, including these breakfasts and many other behind-the-scenes operations. She lives in Woodbridge with her husband and spends most of her free time volunteering for the Ladies of Liberty Alliance and exploring of ancestral health, sustainable agriculture, and alternative educations. Deirdre?
Thank you, Morton. Good morning, everyone. So nice to see all of you. As usual, lots of regulars out there. So I have some good news and a little bit of bad news. So I'll start with the bad. We've canceled the July Wednesday Wakeup Club breakfast. However, I think you'll appreciate the reason. We have canceled it because after a 3-year hiatus, we are resuming the National 4th of July Conservative Soiree. Yes. And would you believe this is the 49th soiree? I think Morton probably can believe that. I've only done 5 and it feels like 49. But each year we have more than 900 liberty-loving local conservatives that attend the soiree. It features live bluegrass band, barbecue, ice cream, field games, kids activities. Recently we've added a beer and wine garden, and a keynote speaker that will be announced soon. And would you believe all of this is for the steep price of $0? Thank you to the donors for that. And also to the sponsors. So please see the flyer in your programs. It's been folded inside of there that has all the details about this event. We're hosting it again in Occoquan Regional Park, and it is from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and you guessed it, it's on the 4th of July. And like I said, there's still time to sponsor this conservative community event. It's an all-hands-on-deck situation, so it's a real team effort. We have lots of local businesses, conservative organizations, including our guest speakers organization, National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, always a mouthful. So you can please reach out to me or anyone on my team. You can also visit the website. All the information is on the flyer. There's even a fancy QR code for those of you who are savvy enough to use your smartphones for it, but otherwise you can follow the address on the website to learn more. All right, thanks so much. Hope to see you all there.
Thank you, Deirdre. Deirdre has a very demanding job and does her work very well. Now to introduce our speaker, I present to you Jordan Deibler. He is the political and fundraising training intern here at the Leadership Institute. He hails from Sunbury, Pennsylvania. He majors in political science and minors in economics at Pennsylvania State University, University Park. He serves as an at-large representative in the University Park Undergraduate Association, which is their student government at Penn State. He's an active member of the Penn State College Republicans, and he interned for Congressman Fred Keller of Pennsylvania's 12th District in his district office. After graduation, Jordan intends to work as a campaign operative and one day plans to run for office. Jordan?
Morning, everyone. So I'm here to introduce Mr. Mark Mix. Mr. Mix is the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation and as well as the National Right to Work Committee. Under the leadership of Mr. Mix, the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation has continued to provide unparalleled free legal assistance to workers and has protected workers from the abuses of compulsory unionism. Mr. Mix frequently appears on national television shows, including Fox News Channel's Your World with Neil Cavito, Glenn Beck, and Fox and Friends, and has appeared multiple times on CNBC and CNN as well. Similarly, Mr. Mix's writings have appeared in national outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, Investor's Business Daily, Washington Examiner, and National Review. Mr. Mix is also a sought-after speaker on political technology and grassroots lobbying tactics. Mr. Mix holds a BA in Finance from James Madison University and an associate degree in Marketing from the State University of New York. Prior to joining the National Right to Work Committee in 1990, Mr. Mix worked for several state-level right-to-work groups, He joined the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation in 1999. Mr. Mix is a longtime friend to Mr. Blackwell and the Leadership Institute. His daughter was the previous intern coordinator here at the Leadership Institute. Mr. Mix often comes to the Leadership Institute to speak to the interns in order to provide them with valuable advice for their futures. Mr. Mix and his amazing wife Diana reside in Fairfax, Virginia, and have 6 children. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mark Mix.
Well, thank you. Are we working here okay with my mic? You know, I get this out of the way right at the beginning. Podiums scare me for obvious reasons. You know, most people that come to podiums are really tall, but I know as a requirement to be leadership institute, I have to stay in proximity of the logo here for internet purposes and for everything else. But it's a pleasure to be with you here again at the Leadership Institute. One thing that Jordan didn't mention is I'm a graduate of Leadership Institute schools. I have several diplomas on my wall from the Campaign Leadership School, the Television Preparation School, the Youth Leadership School. In fact, my job was, I got my job through the Job Talent Bank at the Leadership Institute back in I don't even want to say this, 1986. I know I don't look that old, and thank you for that. I know people smiling around there. It looks really good. I still look pretty good for 70. I look not so good for 60, but anyway, here we are today, and it's great to be at the Leadership Institute with you, and I will remain near the podium if you'll allow me, but I do fear standing behind them for failure for you to see me. Mark Twain is credited with the quote of saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And I looked that quote up, and basically he stole it from somebody else, but he gets the credit for basically using that quote. And there's a lot to that quote. History does not repeat itself, but it intends to rhyme. It intends to rhyme. And in labor policy, we're at a really interesting juncture in our country's history when it comes to labor policy. So what we're going to try to do today, and I know I've got a hard stop here according to the program. I usually go on for, I can make this 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and I can get an hour and a half version here for everybody. So if you need coffee, go now. No, actually, it'll only be about 20 minutes. But let's talk about 75 years ago this month in the United States Congress. 75 years ago this month, there was an amazing event that occurred down in Washington, D.C., and that was the passage of what is known as the Taft-Hartley Act. And this is a bill that was introduced in the Senate by Senator Robert Taft and in the House by Fred Hartley Jr. of New Jersey. And this bill was a response to a major power grab that union officials were able to get back in the 1930s under the Roosevelt administration. And just to give you a little history as we move to 1947, 75 years ago, I want to tell you about what happened with labor policy prior to the Taft-Hartley Act, and that was the Wagner Act of 1935. Even then, I'm going to go back to 1933 because Congress at the time, never lets a good crisis go to waste. And so during the economic downturn of the country, Congress and Franklin Roosevelt decided they wanted a federal labor policy. And so they introduced a bill called the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this was a tremendous power grab by the federal government, taking the management and the legal implementations of federal labor policy or of private sector labor policy and brought it back to Washington. They do this quite often. Every time they get a chance to take power, they do take it, and they brought it back. And so the National Industrial Recovery Act was designed to make the federal government the arbitrator of private sector labor law as opposed to the states where it previously had been. And interestingly enough, that bill passed the House, passed the Senate. Roosevelt supported it, but it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional. And Roosevelt, not ever one to be deterred, decided that he would try it again. So in 1935, they introduced the Wagner Act. This was Wagner was a senator from New York, and he decided that they would take basically the same language that the Supreme Court had ruled unconstitutional and try it again. Well, one of the little anecdotes of this whole story is that Franklin Roosevelt actually decided to write a letter to Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and said, you guys at the Supreme Court are getting kind of old. And we believe that any justice that's over the age of 70, if they stick around for 6 more months, they ought to have an associate justice that would help them with the heavy burdens of the workloads of the Supreme Court of the United States. And so at the time, that was going to mean 6 new members to the United States Supreme Court, take it up to 15. This was the famous court packing of that era. And so the Wagner Act and a couple other bills got through the Congress again, and it got to the Supreme Court.
And interestingly enough, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and Associate Justice Owen Roberts switched their votes, and they decided to team up with the Three Musketeers as opposed to the Four Horsemen. And on a 5-4 vote, the United States Supreme Court said that this federal policy controlling labor management relations in the United States was perfectly fine, and here we go. So from 1935 to 1945, union movement grew dramatically because they had the federal power to force workers into these union collectives. You had to be a member of the union, you had to participate with the union, even though you didn't ask for it, didn't want it, or didn't vote for it. So from 1935 to 1945, during the war effort, the union movement grew dramatically. But the union leaders at the time, the union bosses at the time, understood the power they had been granted by the federal government. And union bosses like John L. Lewis with the coal miners worker and Walter Reuther with the United Auto Workers understood the power they'd been granted. And they used that power, not so much during the war efforts, but as soon as 1945 rolls around, September 2nd, 1945, the so-called VJ Day, or VJ Day, the union bosses in America decided to exercise the full-throated power they'd been granted by Congress. And over the course of 1 year, 12 months, from September 2nd, 1945 to September 2nd, 1946, over 5 million private sector workers went on strike across the country. 230,000 auto workers, 120,000 coal miners, railroad workers, and transportation workers in Pittsburgh went on strike. 10,000 film crew members, which wasn't really a big deal for the country, but that's okay. But literally, 5 million workers were on strike. And so all of a sudden, Congress recognized what they had going here and what they'd done, giving this private organization this unique power over not only the American worker, but obviously over the American economy. And so in 1946, things started bubbling up, and Senator Robert Taft of Ohio and House Member Fred Wagner Jr. of New Jersey decided they would put in a bill that would reform this Wagner Act. The Wagner Act was basically designed to limit the ability of employers to interfere with with workers' desire to unionize. And it created all sorts of unfair labor practice charges for employers, but left union officials completely unhinged and completely free of any control under the same law of the Wagner Act. So the Taft-Hartley Act was designed at first to basically radically change and bring the union officials under the same type of control that the private sector employee or employers were under. And so what happened there is all of a sudden the union officials are starting to understand that flex their power. And in the 1946 election, something really interesting happened. The Republicans took control of the House and the Senate, which was very interesting. I think for the last 20 years, or at least the last 20 years, they had not had any control at all. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt was a four-termer, and Harry Truman now was the President of the United States. And so they introduced the Taft-Hartley Act, and we know from an original source, a primary source, that Senator Taft was interested in repealing the entire Wagner Act and going back to state regulation of labor policy, which makes the states these laboratories of policy and allows them to create opportunities that other states may not want to have. But of course, in Washington, once we create something, we very rarely get rid of it. And of course, they didn't get rid of it, but they passed what is known as the Taft-Hartley Act. And the Taft-Hartley Act was, as I mentioned, bringing union officials under the control of the federal labor policy. Well, this bill, obviously President Truman came out and said, I oppose it, I will veto it if you pass it, but pass it did. Back in April and May, it passed, and on June 4th, I think it went back to conference committee, which will be, 3 days from today. It went to the conference committee, and the House passed it first, then the Senate passed it, and it went to the President, and on June 23rd, 1947, President Truman said, I oppose it, he vetoed it, and they overrode the veto with 321 votes in the House, and I think 68 votes in the Senate. And so the Wagner Act was amended by the Taft-Hartley Act, and that brings us to where I'm at today and why this is important to you, because one of the provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act was a little-known section called Section 14B. 14B. And 14B said that if a state, by affirmative vote, could authorize could outlaw the so-called closed shop union shop, they could do it and they could become what is known as a right-to-work state. Since 1947, 27 states have exercised that privilege granted by the federal government to the states and passed what are known as right-to-work laws, including the Commonwealth of Virginia, where we're eating breakfast this morning. It's one of the states that passed it in 1947, right after the Taft-Hartley Act was certified, and states could use this power. They passed their right-to-work law. Right-to-work laws are extremely simple. And that's why I've been able to stick around so long at the Right to Work organizations, because basically we believe that every worker should have the right to join a union, but no worker should be compelled as a condition of employment to provide support or associate with a labor union if they choose not to. Unfortunately today, the federal labor policy, the National Labor Relations Act, which is the Wagner Act and the Taft-Hartley Act, are combined today to be called the National Labor Relations Act, still allows union officials to force their representation on an individual, and then to add insult to injury, they allow union officials to have a worker fired if they don't pay union dues or fees to get or keep their jobs. It's clearly outrageous, and it's one of those issues that it's not necessarily, well, it hasn't been, it is kind of now, but it hasn't been a marquee issue for conservatives. You know, tax policy, gun policy, life, those issues have taken kind of the marquee lights of a public policy debate. But the right to work issue is becoming a very prominent and very important part of our dialogue and how union officials have grown their power, particularly in the public sector now, to control government and to exercise that power at a cost to individual rights, taxpayer pocketbooks, and control of government across the country. So we at the National Right to Work Committee, we've been around since 1955. We were founded by 5 railway employees who, after 1951, when Congress authorized the forced payment of dues under the Railway Labor Act, they got together and said, we don't like this and we're going to oppose it, and they formed the National Right to Work Committee. Since 1955, the committee has been working to pass right to work laws. It is a difficult battle because we're going up against a very powerful political force in organized labor. I mean, it would be pretty cool if we could mandate that the Leadership Institute would do all training of all college students in the country, or the Right to Work Committee would make all the labor policy in the country. If we get government to do that, we'd probably be sloppy and wouldn't have as quality of a product as we would today. But it's been a strong battle. Union bosses collect about $20 billion a year, every year, and they spend about over $2 billion every 2 years on politics. And the reason they have to do that is because their power is a derivative of government action. So they've got to be at the school board, they've got to be at the county commission, they've got to be at the city council, they've got to be in state legislative races, they've got to be in congressional races, and they have to be in a presidential race. And that's manifesting itself right now under the Biden administration, who claims he is the most pro-union president in the history of America, and he's used the word union more than any president in the history of America, but we still are kind of holding him at bay on a couple things that I'll talk about in just a minute. The second part of our program is the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, as mentioned by Jordan. We provide free legal aid to employees across the nation whose rights have been violated by forced unionism. In 1968, we decided that a legal program was part of the overall program to protect workers from forced unionism. And since that time, we've been to the U.S. Supreme Court 18 times. And 4 years ago this month, we won probably our biggest victory in the United States Supreme Court, a case called Janus v. AFSCME. Janus says that no government worker anywhere in America can be compelled to pay dues or fees to a union in order to work for government. That's a pretty big win. That's a national right to work law for the public sector. And why is that important? Because the union movement in America today has basically as many, and probably more today, government union members than there are private sector union members in America. And this is really where the action is now, in the government. Union officials understand this. Victor Gottbaum, the old AFSCME president from New York City, basically said it's kind of neat when you can elect your bosses and you can sit at the table with them and decide to negotiate over all of our money, the taxpayer money and the power of unions. It's a very dangerous thing. Not only did Franklin Roosevelt oppose it, President Coolidge opposed it, President Wilson opposed it, President Reagan opposed it. I mean, they all talked about the notion you can't put the private sector labor relations model in the public sector because government provides so-called necessary services. They've gone way beyond that now, but still, we're recognizing unions to negotiate over our tax dollars and over government policy. And you've seen what the teacher unions have done in our schools. You've seen what the SEIU and AFSCME have done to governments in, like, Illinois, for example. Illinois is on the precipice, Emily. Unfortunately, you need to get out because they're going to go bankrupt here very shortly. So just remember that. Because of the union power, it is a really interesting situation. But the Janus v. AFSCME case was on behalf of an Illinois employee. He worked in Springfield, Illinois, and he was a child financial services administrator, and or an administrator worker, decided to stand up and say, I don't want to pay union dues anymore. This is outrageous. The union's spending money on things I disagree with, and so therefore, I'm going to sue them. And you know, it's that type of courage that is the kind of the ink on paper of the right to work movement. Individual workers who have the ability to stand up and be counted against intimidation and coercion and in the faculty room in schools across the country, all of a sudden your friends are no longer your friends because you won't sign up for this collectivist, monopolist union. It's a very difficult thing for people to do that. The foundation provides support for them. We can't provide physical protection for them in many instances, but we can supply excellent legal service. And we've done that 18 times, argued 18 cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of workers. We've won 3 major Supreme Court cases just in the last 10 years. It's been very exciting. Getting back to the legislative side, though, and the impact of Taft-Hartley and that story from 75 years ago, we now have 27 right-to-work states in the country that have passed it. We had 5 new right-to-work states in the last 10 years. We started out in Indiana, then we got Michigan, then we got Wisconsin, then we got Kentucky, then we got West Virginia. 5 new states that have said, you know what, we'll let you join the union, but we're never going to let you fire someone if they don't tender dues or fees to that union. And that's a pretty big win for us. And it's mattered because we now, I think, we have more than a majority of states, and we think as the program shows that those right-to-work states attract jobs, investment, and opportunity, we're going to grow that support, and I'm optimistic about it. Just like the Taft-Hartley Act, when 321 members of the House voted to allow for right-to-work laws, we think there's a Congress somewhere on the horizon, maybe not this next year, but the year after, perhaps the year after that, that's going to say this idea of forced compulsory unionism is an anathema to the individual freedoms that we expect and are part of our founding documents. I mean, the First Amendment talks about the right to free speech and the right to associate. How can a law that says you must associate with an organization you didn't ask for, didn't vote for, and didn't want, how can the law say that you must associate with them? I mean, it's a real interesting privilege for American labor bosses. And then, on top of all that, how can you force this association and then say you have to pay them for them taking away your right to associate? The Janus case actually got to that point of First Amendment constitutional privileges. It was a First Amendment case. The Supreme Court, led by Justice Alito, said that certainly taking money from someone, using it to lobby government, and that turning around and using it for politics and lobbying government is a violation of your speech rights. And of course, he had a majority that agreed with him on that, and therefore we have this Janus decision. But somehow the private sector workers don't have the same First Amendment protections that public sector workers have. We're working on that. There's still litigation to be done. But from a standpoint of where we are now in defending against Joe Biden, the most pro-union, most pro-forced unionism president in American history, we have lots of work still to do. And I would encourage you to pay attention to it, because as we look at the public policy debate, there are a lot of big movers and shakers that get their names in the paper all the time. People like Soros and MoveOn.org and Al Sharpton and all those folks. But the money behind the left movement in this country, you can go back and you can look at the union movement and you can see this radical shift from the Lane Kirkland, solidarity movement in Poland with Lech Walesa to John Sweeney, the president of the AFL-CIO, who was a card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America. That's where the union movement's gone. And that disconnect actually is hurting the unions very much in the private sector. We all know that President Trump would have never been elected if rank-and-file union members in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Indiana, and Illinois hadn't voted for him for president. He just wouldn't be the president of the United States. Union officials will never admit to that because they know that the chasm between the rank-and-file union members and the leadership here in Washington, D.C., or the bosses here in D.C., it's not necessarily leadership, the bosses here in D.C., is growing wider and wider all the time. And that's pretty much predictable when they think about their future is in government and government unionization. We tend to work on bills to try to stop the unionization of government employees. We don't want to stop anyone from joining a union. If you're a fireman or a police officer or a teacher and you want to join the National Education Association or the American Association of Firefighters, have at it. Have at it. Just don't require that the government negotiate contracts with you that impose their will and their expenses on taxpayers across the country. That's Franklin Roosevelt's argument against public sector unionization. That was Ronald Reagan's argument against public sector unionization. That was Calvin Coolidge's argument against public sector unionization. And it was President Wilson's argument against public sector unionization. That's a pretty bipartisan group of folks. And when they can all agree, we should agree too, that unions have no place in between taxpayers and elected officials. And so the right to work cause is about individual freedom first. It's about opportunity second. And it's about the idea of exercising First Amendment rights in this grand experiment of self-government that we in the United States want to protect, want to expand, and want to hold dear as we think about public policy. It's getting harder and harder as government grows and grows. I mean, I was at a Fairfax City Council meeting till 1 o'clock in the morning a couple months ago when they imposed a rain tax on the citizens of Fairfax. So the amount of, what is it, impervious land that you have now gets taxed. I just got my first bill in the mail the other day, and hopefully they split it in two so they wouldn't anger us too much. We have half the anger that we would have now that they've only charged us half of it. So, but government continues to grow. They tax everything we do, and the power behind that are union officials. I mean, in Colorado, on 2 days ago, on Saturday, Governor Polis signed a bill that will allow the unionization of 40,000 county employees. The county executives in the state of Denver, or the state of Colorado, said that it would cost upwards of $25 million in one county alone. It costs $2 million just in administrative costs. Who's paying those costs? We are as taxpayers. Well, the people in Denver are there. But in Virginia, from 1993, the National Right to Work Committee, we ran a program that actually prohibited union officials from negotiating with government officials over terms and conditions of employment in the Commonwealth. The first thing that the Democrat majority did under Governor Northam was say, we're going to allow people to bargain. The unions are going to bargain. So Fairfax County, Prince William County, Loudoun County, Chesterfield, or not Richmond down there, they're going to start negotiating with unions, and we'll watch the cost of government grow dramatically. So the union movement, while it's not one of those real sexy conservative issues, it's an important issue, not only for you, from a standpoint of the ability to control the size and scope of government, but two, also the opportunities that your children will have. You know, the biggest export in Illinois is young people like Emily, because there's no jobs and no opportunity. The right to work states, 27 states that have double the job creation in the high-paying manufacturing job sector and in private sector jobs in general. I mean, so it's demonstrable that freedom works. And I like to say that because freedom works and freedom works, meaning it works as individuals, our freedom, but it also works because it creates jobs and opportunities for our children. And that's important, and jobs and opportunities for this young intern group that's right here too. You'll end up in a right to work state, I promise you, someday. Some of you, I can't promise that, but to others, I think I can promise that. So as we think about right to work and individual freedom and the other issues of freedom, I would ask you to look us up, take a look at what we do and how we do it, and join with us in the fight to protect voluntary unionism in America. 75 years ago, we were able to get the opportunity to pass right to work laws. Hopefully in another maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years, we can pass a bill introduced by Rand Paul in the United States Senate and Joe Wilson in the State House called the National Right to Work Act. And I know Larry cringes at this federal power grab that we're trying to implement, but it doesn't add one single word to federal law. It's a one-page bill, and it simply repeals those provisions of the Wagner Act that allowed union officials to have that power to force workers to pay dues to get or keep their jobs. That bill would repeal that language and make the bias in federal law voluntary unionism. The word voluntary is an important word. We can use it. It often gets kind of downplayed and doesn't have the impact that it should, but it should be part of our labor policy in America. And we're working to the day where not only will we have right to work for every single worker in America, we can also protect their right to associate or not to associate with a labor union. With that, I will be glad to take questions. I know that we'll have some, and someone's going to ask a really intelligent question that I'm going to give a bad answer to. So let's start that process right now. Okay. We have one here, and then I'll come right back to you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Barbara Bowie Whitman. I came to town when Lyndon Johnson was president, because Kennedy had been shot, of course. And Kennedy, because he was canonized, is thought to have done a whole lot of good things, which I kind of question. But at any rate, he was noticeably missing from your litany of those who support your side of the aisle. And I was taught in my early days as a government worker that it was he who allowed unions into the federal government. Am I correct?
You are correct. Executive Order 10988 was John F. Kennedy. And what that was is very great. It's a great question, a great context, because the power of the public sector unions across the nation was growing dramatically. And Kennedy, you know, was kind of had to be one where he had to be on one side or the other. And the executive order didn't force them to pay dues. In fact, federal employees still have right to work protections. You're not forced to pay union dues to get or keep a job. And only about 23% of the federal workforce has actually voluntarily joined the union. But yet union officials like the American Federation of Government Employees and NAF, I forget all the national unions or the federal unions we have, they have used that power to basically exercise control over the federal government. Kennedy it was a political solution for him, actually. I don't think he was really committed. You know, he and his brother were having a big battle with Jimmy Hoffa in the 1959 Landrum Griffin hearings, and so I don't think he was all in on it, but he did sign that executive order that said the federal government will allow unionization of the federal workforce. And so we're still there today, although the post office is a little bit different. They started to go on strike. There was a little bit of pushback there as well. But Kennedy was the one that did sign that executive order. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Dino Drudy. Is there a possible danger in right now, except for race discrimination, gender discrimination, and so forth, which are constitutional things, employers have an absolute right to hire and fire? If you take a step and say, but you can't fire them for not joining the union, if you have a federal law which says this, are you opening the door to other federal laws? Because, of course, the pushback will be, well, it's not fair to employees if they can't unionize. Even the threat of unionization is enough to secure concessions from employers. If we are going to take away the union's powers, do we need federal laws like Great Britain has and European countries have? Is there a danger of that? Yeah. And my second question is, why have conservatives not tried to organize politically rank and file union members in private sector manufacturing and public sector law enforcement and other places to push back against their liberal union leadership?
Yeah, great question. The first one is exactly why I cited Larry as being opposed to our federal law, because you're right, you do open up a Pandora's box. But remember, the Taft-Hartley Act and the Wagner Act were in response to the repeal of the so-called Yellow Dog contract. If you remember your federal history, there was a law that said you had to hire union members only. You had to be a member of the union in order to get hired. And so the unions were or you couldn't be a union member in order to get hired. So the employers would say, look, are you a union member? And you say yes, you say, okay, we're not hiring you. Well, Congress thought that was so abusive that they decided to pass a law that outlawed the so-called Yellow Dog contract. And then we come along with a bill shortly thereafter that says, oh my gosh, you have to be a union member and pay union dues in order to work or keep a job. I mean, I'm concerned about federal authority, absolutely. I'm a federalist at heart, and that's why we are aggressively promoting right-to-work laws in the states, doing it state by state. But yeah, I think there's a problem with that and the possibility of growing the federal government in that regard. But our position on the right-to-work law, if our bill certainly doesn't add a single word to federal law, it simply makes the bias in federal law voluntary unionism. I mean, I don't see how that extends to other issues, and it says that a union official can't request that an employer have a worker fired for failure to join or pay dues or fees to a union. They can still hire them, they can hire union members, non-union members, but it does protect the worker's individual freedom. So that's the scope of that bill, and it simply goes back in and repeals those provisions in the original law that allow for forced unionism. The bias in federal law now is in favor of compulsion. And so we're just saying, take it out. Ultimately, though, sir, our goal is to repeal the entire National Labor Relations Act. And in fact, Senator Taft, as I mentioned, we had prime information about Senator Taft's desire to do that. We got a call one day from a guy from Ohio. He said, you need to come see me before I die. And we said, well, why would we do that? And he goes, because I was a legislative director for Senator Taft, and I want to tell you that our original discussion about this said that we were going to repeal the entire Wagner Act of 1935. But, of course, as I mentioned, when government creates something, they very rarely get rid of it. They just amend it and regulate it and slice it and splice it a little bit more. The second question you asked was, why have we failed? Oh, why have we failed? Well, it's probably because of my leadership, but I will take responsibility. We've got a lot of hardworking attorneys and a lot of activists that have done a great job. I mean, look, the art of public policy, and Leadership Institute trains us on this very, very well. And, we can educate or we can mobilize or we can do both. But time, talent, and treasure dictate that you have to make priorities and set certain objectives of what you're going to do. I mean, we're a $13 million, the committee's a $13 million a year organization. The foundation's anywhere from 10 to 11. We raise about $25 million a year. We're up against a $20 billion a year business. And I would suggest this, conservatives and Republicans who stand up for smaller government, secure borders, protection of Second Amendment, pro-life, they're attracting all the rank and file union members that they can attract. As I mentioned, President Trump would not have been elected president if it weren't for rank and file union members in those states where he won, Michigan and Indiana and Wisconsin. So there is a movement to do it, whether it's as organized or not, as you'd like it. I tend to shy away from that type of thing in the sense of have good policy and they will come if you build it. I think the Republican Party's done a good job. I mean, Reagan got 44% of rank and file union members' votes by standing up and defending the country, defending the First Amendment. So the need for a formal organization, I mean, I don't want to go to the federal government and say, you know, all non-member rank and file workers have to be a member of the National Right to Work Committee. What we need to do is offer policies and issue initiatives that attract those people. And that's the problem the Democrats have right now, frankly. They're losing that demographic in a very large way because of the radical positions of the leadership of the unions now. And so it's a natural development that we're seeing across the country. I mean, we couldn't pass a right-to-work law in Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and West Virginia and Kentucky unless there was a realignment of that voting bloc that, you know, everyone thinks is monolithic. It's not. If you look at the candidates the Democrats endorse in the Democratic primaries, they are big-time losers when it comes to who wins the nomination. I mean, they have power out of all proportion to their numbers, and oftentimes, when you poke them, you find out there's a little bit of paper there, more paper than a lot of politicians think. And the biggest problem we've got is the courage and the spine of those middle-of-the-road politicians that are trying to please everybody. But I think, to your point, rank-and-file union members are migrating to an agenda that believes in, you know, protecting the border, smaller government, reduce my taxes, reduce the size and scope of government. Those are things that I think are winning issues and do attract rank and file workers. So I would recommend Republicans keep that up, and we'll do just fine. Yes, sir, back here, and then to you, ma'am.
I'd like to ask you about something a little bit off your
Oh boy,
your
don't get too far off.
discussion today, but,
Yeah.
but something that is
Yeah.
important to your committee and the foundation. We just went through a comment period where the Biden administration radically tried to expand, or is radically trying to expand by regulation, the Davis-Bacon Act.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about where the committee and the foundation is on the Biden proposal, and if you're willing to share, what are you thinking about in terms of a legal strategy to challenge that, assuming that the rules will go through as proposed?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the elements of this massive federal spending is that all of the spending has to be spent on union jobs and union manufacturers. You know, Elon Musk was the one guy that didn't get invited to the electric automobile manufacturers meeting at the White House because he doesn't have a union. I mean, Jen Psaki said that, Jen Psaki, I'm sorry. She's no longer there, it doesn't matter. But, you know, said it because he doesn't have a union, that's why he's not there. The Davis-Bacon regulations, this is a very interesting development and one that has a dramatic impact on the cost of government construction. The Davis-Bacon laws came through the 1930s. 1933, I think, is when Congress passed it, and it was specifically designed to stop black workers, African-American workers, from getting into the construction business. It was an outrageously racist policy that continues today with a smile and a happy face on it, saying that, oh yeah, we need to have the best construction and the most competitive construction. It's nonsense. The Davis-Bacon law costs us up to 30 to 40% on every federal project that has any kind of government money in it. And it's basically discriminatory. Only about 12 to 13% of all construction workers in America today are unionized. So what President Biden's saying by promoting this Davis-Bacon policy that on federal construction and the multi-trillion dollars that we're spending is saying that we're willing to pay 30% more and eliminate 85%, 86% of all construction workers from participating in this work. I mean, it's outrageous and no one seems to care, although this gentleman does, and thank you for that. It's an important issue. We have traditionally been kind of on the periphery of the Davis-Bacon issue, but legally we've actually represented employers and employees in California when the government tried to impose Davis-Bacon requirements on all private construction. Didn't even have to have money in it. We took the case over for a construction group that was out there, and we were able to win that and keep it kind of fenced off, if you will, just to government construction. But we as taxpayers ought to understand this. I mean, basically under the rules that they're promulgating, any construction over $35 million, which is basically a mile of highway now, I think, that has any federal money in it must go to a unionized contractor. That is being the most pro-forced unionism president in American history when you're implementing that on top of spending $5-6 trillion and the inflationary nature of that. So we'll be in it. The Associated Builders and Contractors is probably the prime mover and shaker, and those are very effective people, not only across the country and in their local states, but here in Washington, D.C., and they're the prime leaders on that. They're the alpha dog, if you will, or the bell cow, as we use in political process. But we'll stay on top of that. Deidre, I also had one more question, and then I think we got to go. Right here, ma'am. Yes.
Hi. What, if anything, is your organization doing to combat enactment of the PRO Act, which would basically eliminate independent contractors?
I can't believe I didn't mention that. This PRO Act is a bill that's been introduced, and it passed in the United States House of Representatives with no testimony, no hearings. It passed on March 21st last year, and the first thing it will do is it will repeal Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act. And for anyone who was following, that means if we repeal Section 14B, that means all 27 right-to-work states go away, just like that. It's their number one objective of organized labor. It also allows secondary boycotts, which are illegal, meaning that union officials can protest at a customer's office and demand that the target of the unionization drive give in and be unionized. There's a whole host of things in that bill that are bad, and it's the top priority for organized labor. Right now, the bill is stalled in the Senate. As long as the filibuster stays in place, I think we've got it defended. In fact, I think there's probably 3 or 4 Democrats in the Senate that don't ever want to see that bill come up because it has nasties like repealing right-to-work law, secondary boycotts, card check unionization, where workers won't get a chance to vote in secret ballot elections whether or not they want to be in a union. It has the redefining employees as independent contractors. Right now it's stopped, but 225 members of the House voted for that bill. We did get one Democrat, Henry Cuellar from Texas, voted with us on that. But otherwise, that's a nasty, nasty, nasty bill. And I think everyone understands the impact of it, and it's probably it's the biggest battle we have, defensive battle we have right now in Congress. And so we're mobilizing, as a lot of other groups are mobilizing on it as well. So it's exciting. I think we got it stopped. But tomorrow, I stand to be corrected. Okay, thanks for this. Listen, thank you very much for the opportunity. I will take that question offline if we can do that.
Thank you very much for coming here. I just wish we had the leaders of every conservative organization as focused and as effective on their issue as Mark is on right to work. I have been for many years myself a director and on the executive committee of the National Right to Work Committee, and so I can personally see how effective this guy is. The bang for buck to the donors that Right to Work Committee provides are truly remarkable. As a token of our appreciation, let me present to you one of the Leadership Institute's Adam Smith ties. Those who are old enough and have good enough memories will know that Mark's predecessor as head of Right to Work, the great Reed Larson, who hired and advanced and actually arranged for Mark to be his successor, was a faithful wearer of Adam Smith ties. And so here is a tie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I invite you to join us on August 3rd. Remember, early July, we're having the soiree. But on August 3rd will be our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. I encourage you to RSV online at leadershipinstitute.org/breakfast. Father's Day is just a few weeks away, and I would invite you to see my assistant, Andrew Green, at the entry table by the elevators to purchase an Adam Smith attire as a gift. We are the exclusive producer and seller of these accessories in the United States. The folks in Britain created the Adam Smith tie, but the organizations in Britain that created the Adam Smith tie wind up buying a lot of our ties once we got from one of the free market think tanks an order for $7,500 worth of Adam Smith ties, because our ties were of superior quality to those that were available in Britain. You can buy Adam Smith merchandise online through our website. Mark Madsen, will you step up here? Mark is now part of our staff in development. I knew his father, who's also named Mark Madsen, when I was on the Senate staff, and thereafter his father was a key conservative operative on the staff of Senator Orrin Hatch, and I was very pleased that we had Mark Madsen here as first an intern, now as a full-time employee. So I invite anyone who is interested in a tour of our Stephen P.J. Wood building here, and next door, the Emerson and Dolores Wright Center for Campus Reform. If you'll meet Mark here at the podium as we adjourn, he'll give you a great tour of the Leadership Institute and will answer any questions you might have. And if he can't answer a tough question you ask, he'll pop up to my office and ask me. Mark, step on up here so everybody can see you. Thank you all, everyone, for coming to this breakfast.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.